Hello, everybody. My name is Adam Thorne, and welcome to the Australian Aviation Podcast. Before we get into it, I will introduce my two co-hosts, Chris Fenton. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. Nice to be here.
And Jake Nelson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. Also nice to be here.
Before we steam into the news, we have some exciting updates on the Australian Aviation Awards. Chris, talk us through what we know.
Yes, so tickets are on sale now and going extremely well. I checked in with the team earlier today and tickets are selling fast, which is fantastic to hear. The night of nights, the Oscars of aviation, as we've been calling them, although I believe Jake's got an update there.
Yeah, we've had a suggestion for a name for the Australian Aviation Awards. Andrew Morgan. Shout out to Andrew here, has emailed us. Hi, Adam, Chris and Jake. Love the podcast. We love you too, Andrew.
We do.
He says, I've come up with a name for the Australian Aviation Awards, the Triple A's.
That's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
It does put you in mind of a battery. So there is that.
Yeah.
I was thinking actually, you know how in journalism we have the Walkley Awards?
Yeah.
What if in aviation we have the Flyly Awards?
Isn't that like that thing you get at Woolworths where you collect points on them?
No, that's Flybys and it's at
similar.
Coles.
It's similar, whatever. It's, that's my only hesitation. I think AAA is pretty good. Yes, there is the battery thing. But if you were to say something with AAA, you think of it as a AAA credit rating.
Yeah, it's a AAA video game.
Exactly. So
it's energizing.
It is energizing.
See what you've done there.
And we're ever ready to take more suggestions.
Do you think he pre-prepares those, or do you think they come?
I think he might have pre-prepared some of them.
It's
but
a curse.
I like what you did,
Chris. I was cursed by a witch.
Anyway, back to ticket sales because I do want to give a shout out to Lizzie and our awesome team here at Momentum Media in the delegate sales team that handle all of the ticket sales. So if anyone out there, either enthusiast or just keen to get in the room on the night, wants to purchase tickets, you can of course visit the Australian Aviation website and look for the awards section there, purchase tickets, or you can give our team a call. So the number to call is 02 for New South Wales 8357 5440. So that's 02 8357 5440, and have a chat with Lizzie and the awesome team there, and they will be able to help you with tickets to the Triple A's.
I mean, my only concern is that Lizzie's now going to be inundated with messages.
With phone calls. Yeah.
We wouldn't give our numbers because obviously with the celebrity thing that we have,
that's right.
like, could you imagine?
It's in our contract.
Yeah. Anyway,
but I did check with Lizzie beforehand. She said she was more than happy for.
But I don't think she knows what she's getting herself into.
She probably doesn't. So
she
ring
was
away,
half listening.
Let her know that you got the number on the podcast and you want to purchase tickets to the awards. Shaping up to be a brilliant night. We're all excited.
And if you have more name suggestions for the Australian Aviation Awards, send them in. We are happy to receive them, and we will pick the best one and maybe do something with it.
Yeah, it will just be something that, I mean, for whoever sort of wins this or coins this, it's a remarkable, the legacy of that person to have named, you know, what is going to be. I mean, I'm sure these awards will be going on 30, 40, 50 years' time.
Yeah, absolutely they will be.
Yeah. I mean, once the climate wars start, obviously there's going to have to be a break in the awards because we will be, you know, thundering across the desert in tricked out cars with you know, doof wagons and spikes all over them. But
I don't
I'm sure
know.
We can.
Yeah, well, I was going to say we're going to talk about the news. That's a terrible segue into the new. Were you doing science fiction there?
Is Mad Max science fiction?
Oh, this is a Mad Max reference. Oh, I see what you've done.
Well, it's a Mad Max reference.
Yeah.
Mad Max is a delicious Mexican chain.
So basically what we need is if every reference that Jake makes in this show, if you can get them all, and you email us, we'll give you a shout out on the show.
Yeah, I should have like a pun jar here. Just put a coin in it every time.
Maybe we can have, like, people can be playing like drinking games. It's like take a shot when Jake makes a joke.
Every time Jake gives us a pun.
Or a pun, take a shot, and people be completely legless at the end.
I think it would be a hazard to our listeners' health, and I don't want to encourage irresponsible drinking.
That's a message from our lawyer. We will now steam into the news before this gets any more surreal. So we did speak about this a little bit last week. Bonza have cut 5 routes from their early network of, I think it is 27. Now, this is kind of a big story, but for those that aren't aware, Bonza's kind of shtick is that it flies point-to-point routes, and what that means is that it often skips out capital cities, so it goes essentially from a smaller holiday type destination to another smaller holiday type destination, and this is something that has been muted or thought about in Australia for decades, but it's never happened, and it's never happened because there was a thinking that Australia's population was too small and too dispersed for this to work. Bonza, who launched in January, were the first ones to have a good go at this. It feels like they've cut these routes from their network earlier than we would have thought. Jake, tell us a bit more. Does this mean the Bonza dream is dead or not?
I don't think so, Adam. I think it's too early to proclaim the Bonza dream being one way or another. I think it's as Bonza has said. Look, these 5 routes: Sunshine Coast to Coffs Harbour, Sunshine Coast to Port Macquarie, Sunshine Coast to Tamworth, Cairns to Mackay, to Toowoomba to Whitsunday Coast. These were routes where there was not sustainable demand. Contrary-wise, there are 3 very highly performing routes: Sunshine Coast to Albury, Sunshine Coast to Melbourne Avalon, Melbourne Tullamarine to Port Macquarie, that are having their flights increased. So they're going up by 1 flight per week. There are a few other routes that are having their flights per week cut, not because they're underperforming, because there are some days that are not as strong as others, so they're just cutting out the less strong day. And this was... There's a few factors that have gone into this, according to Bonza. One is the fleet size. They've got 4 planes, which is not a large number to be covering 27 routes. We spoke with Carly Povey, the chief commercial officer at Bonza last week, who basically told us, look, we've sort of right-sized the network so that we have the right number of routes for the planes that we have. She said that there is going to be a 5th plane coming, but it's not going to be towards the tail end of the year. So they don't have a lot of planes to begin with, and so they don't have, the airframes to be servicing all 27 routes right now. You also have this, the ongoing talent shortage in the industry has been a factor, in particular some training issues that Bonza has been having. We did speak about this a little while ago, some Bonza cancellations. This was due to them not being able to train up their pilots because of some maintenance issues with their planes. And when you have a new plane like the 737 MAX 8, which is the entirety of Bonza's fleet, if you're training people up, you really got to train them on the plane so that they know how it works.
One of the interesting things is when we spoke to Tim Jordan, the CEO, and I think this would have been 4 or 5 months ago now, he was very candid at their launch and saying we won't hesitate to drop underperforming routes. And he said actually this is something the industry should be doing more often, because he's like, we have the potential to make those kind of snap decisions. Nonetheless, it feels like this has come a bit sooner than we would have thought. Obviously, they used and they've been very great in their communications, I should say.
They've been extremely candid. There's been no. I spoke to Carly Povey, as I said, and she was very sort of forthcoming, and even in their open letter to the customers, it was very sort of straightforward and forthcoming. Like, we have not been performing as well as we liked in these circumstances. We've had a lot of good feedback. Don't get us wrong, said Bonza, but there are some areas that we can improve. We think that these will help us make improvements. There wasn't a lot of spin. It was just, here's the facts. Yes, this has come earlier than we would have liked to, but here are the reasons. I mean, one of the reasons mentioned was they've had that's just an astonishing run of bad luck in some instances. Like, I think it was 9 or 10 bird strikes in the space of as many weeks. Which is not good if you've only got 4 planes. But they've admitted, look, this is sooner than we would have liked. Particularly, they say it was a tough call to drop Coffs Harbour from the network completely. But, Coffs Harbour has come back and said, look, we understand the door is open, and Bonza has said the door is open for us to return to Coffs Harbour in the future. That was, by the way, the route Sunshine Coast to Coffs Harbour that John Sharp from Rex had a go at, saying nobody's going to want to go from between the Sunshine Coast and Coffs Harbour, somewhat presciently, as it turns out. But you have to admit in this whole situation, there's been a lot of, palaver and things that, hoo-ha, as you would put it, Adam. There's been a lot of hoo-ha. Kerfuffle.
Yes.
About, Bonza, this never would have worked. Bonza should have known that. And you sort of have to say, you don't know that it's not going to work until you give it a go.
Exactly. So the whole kind of Bonza mentality, and I'm going to use another, I think this is a British word, the clever clogs have said in the past, the clever clogs at the big airlines will quite literally have teams of people that crunch for numbers and whose job will be to work out what routes they should fly and what they shouldn't and what the frequency should be. And obviously the reason no one's done what Bonza's done before is because the clever clogs have said it will never work. Bonza's argument is you will never know until you actually put these flights on, and that stimulates demand. And they would say, well, if you never try, you never know. And we had a go. It didn't work out, but we're going to carry on kind of gambling until we find the things that stick. Chris, I've ranted on, Jake's ranted on. As a man that's done every job in the industry, what's your views on this?
Look, I think Bonza's done the right thing. They've said right from the start, any route that's not performing, they will exit. As we've all agreed here, it's unfortunate that it's come as early in the piece that it has. I think what's probably unique in this case, in one of the sectors being Sunshine Coast to Coffs Harbour, Bonza's home base is Sunshine Coast. I think had they done Brisbane to Coffs Harbour, it would have been a very different story. It would have been a successful route. But hubbing in or basing in Maroochydore has allowed, or Sunshine Coast has allowed them to give the route a try. Hasn't worked. They've cut it. Boo-hoo, Coffs Harbour. But as both parties have said, the door is open to welcome each other back. And I think if Bonza look at some other routes, Coffs Harbour to potentially Sydney or Coffs Harbour to potentially Adelaide or something like that, but providing us a major hub rather than an off-hub port, I think they could potentially even make Melbourne, Coffs Harbour work. I know Jetstar and Virgin perform quite well on that route. So there's potential for Bonza to make an impact in Coffs Harbour down the line.
And another thing is, as well, I mean, they found some routes that nobody thought would work, but they're increasing the frequency. I mean, who would have thought of flying, for example, from the Sunshine Coast to Albury before?
So yes, arguably they are beginning to prove people wrong. And they would say it was always going to be the case, but it was going to take probably a number of years for them to try out many different routes and get the idea of what's working and what isn't. So in one hand, the story is they probably cut these earlier than we thought. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily a surprise at all.
And there's also, they are still saying we are looking to expand our network. We are looking for a third base. When I spoke to Carly, she was again, characteristically coy about where that third base might be. If I had to guess, I'd say Newcastle is a likely candidate. This is just a guess on my part, but Newcastle has as well put its hand up and said, yes, we'd like to be a third base for Bonza. And I think Newcastle does have the advantage of being quite close to Sydney. It's not, it's not Sydney's second airport, so to speak. That's still being built. But I think Newcastle is close enough to Sydney. They already serve Newcastle, and it would be a good foothold for Bonza in New South Wales, which is, after all, the most populous state.
Well, the other thing to consider there too, Jake, is that Newcastle Airport is an international airport. It's undergoing major upgrades to the international terminal and facilities. And if Bonza were looking to base themselves in Newcastle, keep in mind, listeners, this is pure speculation from us here, that Newcastle, we are not privy to...
Do not book your holiday.
We are not privy to any information. Bonza has not released to us where a third base is likely to be. But it would make perfect sense, Jake, if it was. They could even look at... The MAX has range to fly from Newcastle to the Pacific Islands. So, they could look at opening up international operations if that is something Bonza would consider. It would make perfect sense.
Well, before we wrap this up, and just to go on something that Jake said earlier, one of the things I truly despise is a journalist is kind of PR shenanigans and stuff. Bonza handled this very well. Not only did they kind of give us a heads up before they made the announcement, but they gave us access to interview Carly, and everything was quite straight down the line. It is a perfect storm of things that have kind of slightly gone against them, but I think overall this is certainly not the end for Bonza. Okay, welcome back. So before we were talking about Bonza and them removing 5 routes, and obviously potentially how their network could change over time. A couple of weeks ago, Bonza basically attended a kind of parliamentary inquiry that was looking at competition in Australia, and particularly it was looking at industries which were dominated by 1 or 2 major players, of which aviation was therefore involved. And Bonza were talking about the problems they're having trying to take on this kind of duopoly of Qantas and Virgin. And they were also talking a little bit as well about the problems they've having getting slots at Sydney Airport. Jake, tell us a little bit more about what was said then.
Yeah, this was at Toowoomba at the end of last month. So there was sort of a bit of a road trip there from the House Committee on Economics. They went up to Toowoomba, they went down to Melbourne. This was in Toowoomba. Bonza CEO Tim Jordan was there, and the CEO of airline investments at 777 Partners, which is the owner of Bonza, Manish Raniga. Hope I said that right. He said that what the 777 Partners CEO said was that Sydney Airport is going to be vital. Getting access to Sydney is going to be vital for Bonza in the future, because Western Sydney Airport is still 3 years away, and Sydney Airport is the only game in town if you want to access the Sydney Basin. Love you, Newcastle, but you're a bit far. And so Manish Raniga said that, quote, the length of runway for Bonza is going to run out if the airline can't get appropriate access to Sydney. He said, whilst we have been able to convince Australians, Tim Jordan has certainly been able to convince the shareholders that there is an opportunity, and we are going to continue down this path. At some point in time, not being able to serve the Sydney catchment is going to constrain growth and hamper our ability to create more opportunities for consumers. Now, Tim Jordan said that Sydney, from a catchment perspective, is getting close to a quarter of the population. It's between 20 and 25% of the total market. And he said if we as a business are unable to access that market, it has a significant impact on us and our ability to bring low fares. We see the opportunity to open up many new markets into and out of Sydney, which are currently serviced by one stop, whether that is via Melbourne, Brisbane, or other ports. And he said that being shut out by Sydney is, quote, making a hard execution harder.
Now, just to give people a little bit of background information, one of the issues, or two of the issues Sydney's got, is one that effectively it's full to bursting. That is why we are building another massive airport out to the west. The second issue is this idea of slots. And when we talk about slots, we mean the literal takeoff time. And obviously, some slots are better than others. Ideally, I think you want to fly between, say, 6 and 9 in the morning. And obviously...
in the evening as well.
Yeah, exactly. So some slots are better than others. Now, the rules for how we allocate slots in Australia, like with many other countries, is what they call the 80-20 rule. And basically what it means is if you've got a slot, you can keep it forever as long as you fly 80% of the time. And this has led to the ACCC and a lot of people in the industry saying that effectively airlines can kind of game the system. What they can do is take a slot they don't necessarily need, knowing that they can cancel a large amount of them and still hold this good slot forever. Now, one of the interesting things about this is Sydney Airport themselves, who kind of enforce the rules, but it's not their idea. They don't agree with the way this slot rule works. They think it's in need of reform. Sydney Airport obviously wants to see more competition. It wants to see people like Bonza come in. But it's very, very fascinating that Bonza are talking about this sort of kind of perfect storm of things, and they are saying that, it's going to stunt our growth. We can only go so far as a company until we get access to Sydney Airport.
They're already operating out of one capital city airport, Melbourne Airport, and that's been doing quite well for them, I believe. But it's like Tim Jordan says, Sydney is Australia's major international gateway.
Absolutely.
It is the biggest, busiest airport in the country. And, it serves Australia's biggest city, whatever Melbourne might say. And so...
they may have better coffee, but we've got the better slots and airport.
And better beaches.
True story.
But
We love you, Melbourne.
Tim Jordan did say he sort of hinted that he suspects that there is quote something else going on other than the weather in Sydney. In as far as slots are concerned, he said in the report that you refer to. Referring to the committee, as well as in the recent ACCC report, it seems to imply, and there seems to be general consensus, that it's more than just the weather in Sydney. Unfortunately, that means we're unable to access Sydney. That is unfortunate for 6 million people in that catchment.
So again, to give you a bit more context here, and actually, as well as Tim Jordan from Bonza appearing at this inquiry, also Virgin sent their chief legal officer, and basically, what she basically came out and said was nobody is kind of gaming these takeoff and landing slots. That's not the case at all. In fact, as she said, the exact word was, "There's not a sinister motive behind the high cancellation rate there. It's because of the complexities of flying from Sydney." And these are things we've talked about in the podcast previously. It's the fact that if you have wind, if you have fog, that can have huge...
What I find interesting, though, Adam, and I'm not starting a legal fight with Virgin at all, and I'm not accusing anyone. I always put a disclaimer. I'm not accusing anyone of anything untoward. But what I find interesting, when we had all of those issues at Sydney last week and the week before with ATC being down to one runway, Virgin was the most affected airline with the most cancelled flights out of any carrier. It didn't affect Jetstar as badly as it affected Virgin. It didn't affect Qantas or Rex as badly as it affected Virgin. And I think on one particular morning, Virgin cancelled a total of 16 flights within a morning period.
The problem with all of this is that it's very, very hard to make any definitive allegations against one specific airline and one specific time. And it is for that reason that the ACCC, who kind of extraordinarily did actually come out and effectively say, we believe that you can take advantage of this system, but they never actually said, we think one airline has done this at one time.
Yeah.
You would think that they would have a amount of evidence, but they clearly don't think that evidence is strong enough to make a particular point. So Virgin has come out there and basically said there is not a sinister motive. This is purely due to the complexity of operating at Sydney. Nonetheless, it does feel like a kind of perfect storm. And like Jake was saying, we are going to have another airport in New South Wales that will go a long way to alleviating this, but it's not going to open for years. And when it does open, it's going to be in a staggered start. It will take decade for this thing to become the kind of beast it eventually will do. And the problem is, it's all very well and good saying, oh, well, future generations won't have this problem. If you're Bonza, you don't really care. You need to build your business right now.
Well, and New South Wales consumers want Bonza here now as well. It's proven that we definitely want Bonza flying out of New South Wales or flying out of Sydney or Metro anyway. I guess what I would say to this, if Qantas and Virgin aren't that worried or threatened by Bonza, give them a slot or two. Give up one of your slots to allow Bonza to come in.
And one thing that Tim Jordan was also saying is, it goes back to what you were saying, Adam, as well. Slots in the middle of the day are not especially useful for them. They need to be flying at those peak morning and evening periods.
So one of the points that Virgin made when they appeared is it was quite extraordinarily, but Virgin basically came out and said, we do not believe there is a problem with the slot system. And you could say they would say that, but they also made the point that effectively what she was saying was you've got to kind of earn your stripes. She's like, well, there are slots at Sydney. Yes, they're the off-peak ones, but you need to get into the system, and then maybe further down the road you can upgrade them. But nonetheless, some slots are considerably more valuable than others.
Absolutely, they are.
Wants to fly in the middle of the day, but you cut off so many of your travellers. Obviously, you just generally cut off all business travellers.
Leisure market, absolutely. The business traveller does not want to fly down to Melbourne at midday and then have to spend an extra night away for a meeting the next day. They'd rather get on a 6 a.m. departure, be in Melbourne in time for 9 a.m. with a coffee in hand, off to a meeting, day full of meetings, back to the airport to fly home, unless they've got to overnight for back-to-back consecutive day-to-day meetings. But for the leisure traveller, if I was travelling domestically and it was cheaper for me to travel at an off-peak time, I would certainly put my hand up for that. But the business travelling market, not at all.
So in terms of kind of like what the solutions are to this in the short term, now Rex's Deputy Chairman John Sharp, who I've interviewed on this a couple of times actually, and he ironically was the man who actually introduced this rule when he was Transport Minister, and as he told me, it has come back to bite him on the bum.
Well, if it isn't the consequences of my actions.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes. Now, he basically said, we were too generous with this 80-20 rule, and really it should be more like 90-10 or perhaps even less. But nonetheless, I don't see any actual progress in changing this rule. You've had the ACCC come out very strongly and say we don't agree with it. You've had Sydney Airport come out and say we don't agree with it. But it doesn't feel there's any...
No one's prepared to do anything.
Exactly. Yeah. Which does feel like a more broad problem with all of Australian politics.
To throw a totally random idea out there, I wonder if, and listeners, do write in and share your thoughts here. I wonder if Bonza would consider Bankstown Airport.
Is Bankstown Airport suitable for jets?
It can take jets, absolutely. I'm not sure if it could take something as large as a 737 MAX. That I would have to absolutely research. I know that there's been some jets that have done an emergency landing there in the past due to unforeseeable circumstances. But I wonder if Bankstown Airport would be open to Bonza.
Well, if the trouble is, if it's not open to the MAX, then the MAX is the only thing that Bonza has.
Correct.
You can't land at Bankstown if your jet won't fit there. So.
Very true.
Do you need a consultancy fee if this goes through? Because it does feel like, you need to be charged
with this
stuff.
First.
Yeah.
They heard it here first on the podcast.
Okay, welcome back. So I think it was a couple of months ago, we run a bonkers but true story about aircraft engineers who were essentially asked to accept trousers or pants, as you incorrectly call it in this country, ahead of getting a pay rise. They now say, or the Australian Workers Union now say that they're being asked to give up their work boots to get a deal. This sounds bonkers, Jake. Talk me through this.
Yeah, these workers are out at RAAF Richmond. They are maintenance workers for the C-130 Hercules, which is all the maintenance for that is done by Airbus Australia Pacific. This was a couple of months ago. They were supposedly offered very small pay rises. I think it was like 7.5% over 3 year, which is not a lot. But to sweeten the deal, Airbus offered an extra pair of work pants per year, I believe. So that was the workers did not respond well to that.
No.
And now it seems that according to the union, the brass at Airbus were asking them in exchange for a pay rise or back pay. They were asking the workers to give up their first aid allowance and their allowance for work boots. So they're saying, yes, we'll give you this back pay, we'll give you this larger pay rise, but give us your boots.
Now, what I would say is obviously the union, and credit to their kind of comms team that have seen how they can, I don't say how they can spin this, but they can see how they can play this. If I were negotiating with them, I'd be very careful to make any kind of clothes-related promises. Somehow they've managed to get stung by the same thing twice. I would say that is poor negotiators because you've walked straight into that trap twice now.
I've heard of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but this is ridiculous.
Oh, here we go. Take another drink. Oh, God.
Yeah, no, if that's your sole negotiating tactic, then you should probably get some different tongues to wag around the table. Thank you.
He's on fire.
It is.
I'm here all week. No, they're acting like real heels, if we're using a wrestling term. They got to toe the line. But where was I? Sorry.
How many of these did you prepare earlier?
I didn't. I told you, Chris, it's a witch's curse.
Yeah.
It's a witch's curse. we have to say, Airbus has come back. They've told the Oz and said, no, we didn't suggest this. The workers suggested this. They said, during their dialogues, employees proposed the removal of boots and first aid allowances, which we agreed to, while ensuring ongoing workplace efficiency, safety, and operational compliance. We reject any suggestion that the company is seeking to compromise employee safety through any trade-offs in this negotiation. Now, we have put this to the union. And the AWU secretary, this is breaking news coming through during this podcast. The AWU New South Wales branch secretary Tony Callanan has described this assertion as something that we probably can't repeat on a family podcast.
Okay.
But very strongly refuted this suggestion that the workers suggested giving up their boots, which makes sense if you think about it, because why would the workers suggest giving up their boots or their first aid allowance?
It's a safety area where they would more than likely be required to wear specific boots, steel cap boots potentially. So I can't see the workers giving up something that is required. I guess if they have to give it up, first aid course and boots are a tax write-off at tax time. But I know that if I was in a job that required a certain aspect or uniform, I would expect the company I work for to provide that uniform.
And I must say, the company that owns Australian Aviation is extremely generous with merchandise. We are never sure. For those of you that are watching online, you can see Chris here is wearing his Momentum Media.
Wear it every Tuesday. Black is swimming.
We also have Australian Aviation polo shirts as well. That Chris sorted out. We're actually looking to get some more in for you, Jake, as well.
I appreciate that.
So we can all wear them.
I was just going to surprise you with one going, here's one I prepared earlier.
But my birthday was several months ago. It's a bit late.
Well, they did arrive after your birthday, in fairness.
But yeah, no. So we don't have to worry about using merchandise to negotiate. It's just if anything, there's too much at Australian Aviation.
They look after us well.
They do.
I think ultimately with this Airbus story, I guess we can conclude that the deal wasn't as much of a shoe-in as the negotiators thought it would be.
If you are doing a shot for every pun, you're going to hospital, aren't you? This is a serious.
We want anyone doing the shot for a pun. We want photos that we can share on socials.
Right. Let's move on to one of our final stories of the week, and this is an ongoing story, which is about when Air Services Australia, which is the organisation that essentially oversees air traffic control, have in the last year been quite frequently effectively shutting down air traffic control. Or rather, what they've done more technically is that, in layman's terms, normally where the person in air traffic control tower speaks to the pilot or the pilots and kind of guides them down or guides them up and instructs them, when they effectively shut down airspace, what happens is the aircraft have to talk to each other to self-separate. Now, there's two issues here. One is on the idea of safety. So Air Services Australia say that this technique of them communicating with each other is internationally recognised and perfectly safe thing to do. And they're very, very strong on that, as you could imagine. But a number of pilots, we had a pilots union speak to us, and other people in the industry have said, we do not believe this is safe. The very fact that this is not standard protocol would suggest it's not safe. So obviously that's a kind of a difference of opinion. There's also another argument about whether or not air services are understaffed. So Air Services say they're not understaffed, that they need 800 people, I think it is off the top of my head. They have 900 people. And when they have to do these particular course of action, it's because of kind of short-term a lack of staff. So essentially what they're saying is people kind of call in ill, and this isn't really their fault. But obviously the critics would say if you had more people in the first place, then you would have enough to cover. And what you're saying is having enough staff to run it is an arbitrary number, which is in fact wrong. That's the backstory there. But the reason I bring this up is we have had lots of people both email us at media@australianaviation.com.au, and we've also had countless people who have contacted us commenting on our social media posts as well, many of whom are pilots in the industry who have experienced this. Now, this kind of goes along with the ATSB, who essentially are Australia's kind of air crash investigators, or more to the point, kind of incident investigators. And they themselves have also published kind of anonymous comment and feedback they've had from people suggesting there are issues. Jake, what is the kind of a latest on this? Because it does feel that many people in the industry are speaking out and saying there is a problem here.
Yeah, we've had a couple of comments. We've put a story up today with some of these anonymous comments that we've been getting, particularly from pilots. There's one pilot who told us, as a pilot that operates into Sydney myself, Sydney being a particular problem spot, I've had delays 2 times in excess of 20 minutes, longer than the required fuel holding, 20 minutes, and therefore would have been carrying insufficient fuel if we departed with minimum fuel. Sydney also runs GDP, ground delay program that is meant to delay the departure of aircraft to prevent holding and or minimum speed in the cruise. However, as of late, it is common to receive GDP and a minimum speed cruise with holding. So that's something that one pilot said. There's been another Qantas pilot who said, I've personally had a 2-hour delay on the ground in Townsville the other day due to ATC staff shortage and the use of only one runway in Brizzy. I also wanted to highlight this is an ongoing problem even for Darwin and the military, with the TRA now extended. However, this seems to work better than the military ATC. And this also follows these anonymous RepCon reports from air traffic control staff that the ATSB published last month. These were concerned with staffing levels at Sydney Airport in particular. One employee sort of invoked the whole palaver over the safety issues with the 737 MAX, saying air services is going to become the next Boeing. It's only a matter of time before the current practices result in a major aviation incident. It actually goes back to a metaphor that I think, Chris, you brought up last week, the Swiss cheese. Mm-hmm. This person said, eventually the holes in the cheese will line up, and I want to have a clear conscience that I told someone of the unsafe practices air services has adopted. And another ATC has said, the only solution is training more staff. It will be years before this problem is fixed. In the interim, this person says, I honestly have no idea what to do, probably permanently closing airspace overnight or reducing operational hours or services, then rebuild over the next 5 years and slowly extend operational hours and services with the correct people. The ATC also said, the alternative is to bumble along and hope no one flies into one another. It's just a matter of time until we stop getting lucky.
Now, what is very interesting about that is obviously the comments that we have are anonymous comments. So it's very difficult to, even if we knew who they are, verify the exact moment that these things happen. And that's an important disclaimer. However, the ATSB, who are the authority on this, have felt it necessary to put some of the comments they've received in the public domain as well. So they clearly also believe there is some merit into what they're saying. Now, you may wonder why it is that air services are kind of on the defensive, because you might say, well, why don't you just come out and say, we don't have enough staff, we're sorry, we're trying our best, etc. And wouldn't that just be the better option? The reason why they perhaps aren't saying that is one of the accusations is essentially that COVID took an underlying issue and made it a lot worse, because you had too many people sort of take redundancy or take early retirement or just essentially leave during that period. And that problem was very much exacerbated by the shutting of the borders. And obviously we know that in the incredibly niche skill of air traffic control, you will have migrants, you will have people that move around the world to do this. All of these things have come together and we've been spat out the other end with probably not enough people than we need. But as Jake was alluding to there, it's not as simple as you just put a job advert up and in they come. This is a long, long process, and this lag time is what's causing the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know for a fact, I shared with you earlier this week, it popped up on my LinkedIn, Air Services Australia are currently advertising for their 2024 ATC graduate program down in Melbourne, with applications closing soon. If anyone out there is interested, Air Services Australia would love to hear from you. We'll give you a free plug. But the course is not a short course. It's a long course. It's based down in Melbourne. And then there's no guarantee that you're going to end up somewhere like Sydney. They can post you anywhere in Australia. So it's, I guess Air Services Australia need to look long and hard at their recruitment process, their offering process, to ensure that the right people are offered the positions that they want in the cities that they want on graduating a course. But it's scary that it's a reader has commented saying that the holes in the cheese are starting to line up. That's pretty scary.
That was a RepCon report to the ATSB.
Yep.
That was RepCon, yeah. There was another, you alluded, Adam, to this incentive program, the retirement incentive scheme. This was offered by Air Services, I think last year. But one of these other Repcon reports says ATC is severely understaffed. It's been this way, but functional for years. But the last 3 months have been particularly bad. The RIS that ASA, Air Services Australia, offered last year has taken us to unprecedented levels of staffing and is pushing the system way beyond its limit. Another person said, the company has eroded the collective experience level of the controllers at Sydney by paying many to leave. This has left a significant void in our knowledge base. The list of misgivings is so long it's hard to articulate. It's overwhelming the way management is mitigating away safety standards and training requirements for staff. Now, we have to give Air Services' side of the story. Air Services has responded to this ATSB publication. Air Services says, quote, the reports imply that the Sydney TCU, Terminal Control Unit, does not have sufficient air traffic controllers to provide the necessary service. This is not correct. Our workforce plan states the mature number of ATCs for Sydney TCU is 47. Currently, there are 47 operational ATCs employed at the Sydney TCU, with up to 13 required to staff the TCU on any one shift. They've also come back again and said, while Sydney TCU has the required number of staff, as with all organisations both within the aviation sector and broader economy, Air Services has experienced higher levels of staff unavailability due to COVID-19, influenza and other related sickness. This is resulting in occurrences of late notice, unplanned absences that cannot be covered due to duty time and other issues. As a result, there have been increased overtime shift work by some ATCs, but these are in line with pre-pandemic overtime hours worked. And they have said again that these procedures that they implement to cut when these unplanned absences can't be covered, quote, are safe and internationally recognised procedures that have been followed for many decades at the Sydney TCU without incident.
What I would say more generally, having worked as a journalist for far too many years now, is if you're a journalist and you write a story that somebody doesn't like, if you're the PR or you're the comms professional, your immediate response will not be to say we don't like it or we don't think it's fair. It's to say this is wrong, this is factually incorrect.
So you're going somewhere else there?
No. But in reality, it's all different kind of shades of grey. And of course, Air Services have their opinion as to whether or not they're understaffed. Other people have their opinion as well. We do try when we report these things and when we talk about it on the podcast to make it as balanced as possible.
I think the key thing there, and sorry to cut you off there, Adam, is in Jake's readout there, Air Services Australia are saying that they've got 47?
47 in the Sydney Terminal Control Unit. So they say the mature number of ATCs for Sydney is 47. Currently, there are 47 operational ATCs employed with up to 13
the mature number is
on any one shift.
47. They've got exactly 47. Not more than 47. Yet they keep on assuring us that they've got...
You could also make the argument here as well that in early part of last year, early part of 2022, it was very common that, you know, people had kind of COVID isolation and COVID sickness, and it was a very, very common thing. You know, we put events on in other kind of brands within our Momentum Media portfolio, and we had a nightmare sometimes with speakers at events who had to pull out that morning because they had a COVID test. I would say whether that how much that problem is now, it feels like that's a lot less of an issue than it was last year. So the argument would be that while you could understand those situations arising 12, 18 months ago, the argument is you're using a little bit of an out-of-date argument. And if it was the case that you saw issues last year, then you should have been preparing for this to continue.
And if they know that they need 13 controllers to operate a proper shift at Sydney Airport in Sydney Control Tower, then employ another 13 to be based in Sydney. So up your staff for staffing levels from 57 to have another 13 spare.
47. There's also a point that the ATSB notes in the opening to this report is that it has received a large number of Repcon reports from air traffic controllers in the past 4 months. They said this last month. 15 of those reports have come from Sydney. By way of comparison, Repcon has received 1 report relating to Sydney in the past 5 years.
Wow.
Now, just to wrap this up, 2 things I would say. If you are a pilot, if you are an air traffic controller, if you are in any way directly affected by that and you want to get in touch with us, you can even email us at media@australianaviation.com.au, and we're more than happy to keep your name anonymous, and or you could send it from different email, etc. We're always very respectful of that. Of course, you could also comment on our social media channels. We post the stories on there, so that's a good place to comment either on the social media media are all on the website as well. But I would say when we get these stories, obviously we put them to air services to get their response. But if you are from air services and you are listening, we'd absolutely have you on the podcast to give your side of the story in full and to break this down from us. So that invitation is absolutely there.
I think there's a lot more to this story than there's a lot more to this story that needs to be told, and I'm pretty confident our listeners can rest assured we won't let it go. We'll certainly stay on top of this one. It's a hot topic, it seems.
It is.
Yeah.
Time has almost been us. Jake, have I forgotten anything here? I'm looking through the tabs on my laptop here. Is there any burning stories that we haven't discussed? This isn't setting you up for a joke, by the way, to be clear.
Understandable. No, I mean there was that pilot that was charged for claiming to be a lawyer the other week.
Yes.
Naughty.
Yes, which as one person on Facebook pointed out, is better than a lawyer claiming to be a pilot.
That's true. Well, I think we've got no teddy.
I do have a shout out.
Go, we got more.
Yeah, I've got a shout out.
Yeah,
That's
go
it.
on.
So a shout out to Brad from Fly on E. He's one of the awesome pilots at Fly on E. You and I actually met Brad down in Melbourne at an event during the Avalon Air Show. But Brad reached out on socials saying that he's loving the podcast and the video podcast.
People love it, don't they?
He's loving the video podcast. So I promised Brad a shout out. So Brad, the awesome pilot from Fly on E over in WA, this is your shout out, mate. Thanks for listening and your support of the podcast and the team.
I just think, and this is all very well and good, but you know that cameo thing, where you hear this service where like celebrities like us three, people get in touch and they record a personalised video.
Oh, we could so do that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking we start charging for this because I understand our warm hearts and generosity, but there's money to be made here. The amount of shout outs we're doing now, we need to monetize this.
We will also accept frequent flyer points from any of the major airlines.
Flyer status upgrades. We'd love some of that. Model aircraft, wardrobe for you. The endorsements.
Please, if you've got a new wardrobe for Adam, please, dear God, please send it in.
Yeah, well, before our egos get bigger or my self-esteem goes down, we will wrap things up for this week.
Wasn't aware it could go down any further, Adam.
Well,
I love you, Adam. You're my best mate.
We will wrap things up. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure
Jake,
to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And if you have made a note of how many puns Jake made, and if you can name them all, we'll give you a shout out. And if you can do that, we will send you an Australian Aviation polo shirt in the post at some point when we get that sorted.
Absolutely.
That's legally binding. You can't get back on that now.
And we will be back on this show, same time next week. But for now, from us, goodbye.
See you later.